Okay, welcome everyone to the broad spectrum introspection, metacognition and self-awareness across the various domains symposium. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thanks for coming by. And I want to start by introducing the symposium first, like what is the idea of putting it together. And I want to start by saying that metacognition is the ability to monitor and control one's own cognitive states. But a question that emerges is like, which cognitive states are under our control? If we go back to this landmark paper by Flavel in '79 that introduced the term metacognition to psychology in modern times, he started with memory mostly, but then he says that the monitoring is of a wide variety of cognitive enterprises. Here's another classic by Nelson and Narens, where they also focus on memory, but they say that many of the points apply as well to other aspects of cognition. More recently, in this massive effort led by W. Rachnev, the confidence database that collects tens, maybe at this point, hundreds of experiments on metacognition, the authors say that researchers from a wide range of fields use ratings of confidence to provide fundamental insights about the mind. In philosophy, things aren't very different. David Rosenthal writes that introspection involves consciously and deliberatively paying attention to our contemporaneous mental states, all of our mental states. When Wu focuses on mental properties, all of them. Maya Spenner defines introspection as being about our own minds, mental states in general, and gives a wide list of types of states, experiences, thoughts, and emotions. Now, a problem with these ambitious definitions is that when you look at what we as a field actually do, we focus a lot in just a few of these cognitive domains. For example, in the confidence database, most studies are meta-memory and just visual perception. If you go to Google Scholar, you'll see that most metacognition and vision studies are on vision, a few on auditory perception, very few on olfaction and haptic perception, which in its turn, perception is dwarfed by the studies on meta-memory. And I don't want to imply that there aren't many other cognitive domains being studied. Many of you here study them, metacognition of agency, metacognition of decision-making, metacognition of general knowledge, but the vast majority of studies are focused on just memory and vision. And I don't want to point fingers. I have been guilty of these in this paper where I, very ambitiously talk about how confidence in general tracks consciousness. On note 1, I say that my analysis is going to be limited to visual experiences. Here's another example of my own making. We talk about the main general metacognition, and by that we mean in visual perception and memory. So I thought that this was an issue in the field because some questions that we want to answer really can only be answered if we broaden our perspective. Why do we tend to focus on vision and memory? Well, historic reasons. Flavel and Nelson and Narens and others who founded the field, like focus on memory, for example. We also rely on very established fields. Like, for example, vision science and memory are actually very big in their own right compared to other domains. So it's not surprising that we do meta-memory and meta-perception. Maybe they are more computationally tractable and allows us to do more in-depth studies if we really focus on just one domain or a few of them. But why do we need a broader approach? One of the things that I think really matters is that cognitive domains may have very strong idiosyncrasies, right? Like not every domain is the same. There is maybe some, but not a ton of reasons to think that metacognition of every single domain is going to work in the same way. And we want to know what those differences are. If we want to test whether metacognition is a domain general capacity, we really have to test many domains, not just a few. If we want to train metacognition and allow it to transfer to other domains, it's also important to test it across a wide variety of them. We want to understand clinical pathologies better, which might affect metacognition in very different ways depending on which domain is affected. And just other domains are cool too. For example, what other areas could we focus more as a field? Metacognition of causal reasoning. There is a few studies on that, but not a ton. Metacognition of general knowledge, not just these psychophysical lab experiments that we design. Metacognition of fake news detection. How good are people at knowing that they're being duped? Metacognition of intuitive physics. It's a huge field in vision science, intuitive physics. And at least to my knowledge, there are no studies of metacognition, or at least not per se, right? Metacognition of time perception, another darling of psychology and philosophy. I don't think there are any or many studies on that. Metacognition of probabilistic reasoning. People struggle with these. Are people confident of how they reason about probability? We don't know that well. Metacognition of general predictions, for example, like astral code extend style, where you ask people to make random prediction across a wide variety of domains, and you can tell that some people are just better at making these predictions, and it will be interesting to know if they know that they are better. And with that, this is how this symposium was born. We're going to focus in some of these less studied domains within introspection and metacognition, hoping to open a discussion about the importance of broadening our approach and having other domains in that we study. So the plan for today is I'll start with my talk talking about domain generality and some challenges that we face. Then Tony Cheng from the National Chengchi University of Taiwan is going to talk about tactile introspection, followed by Elisa Filevich, who's going to talk about metacognition in motor control. And finally, Sarah Garfinkel, who's going to talk about interoceptive accuracy and interoceptive awareness in autistic individuals. The plan is that we'll talk for about 20 minutes. Maybe I'll talk for a little bit less because I've already bite into my time. But people will have 20 minutes and then 5 minutes of Q&A. And then at the end, we're hoping to have time for a more general discussion. All right, that's what I just said. So how many metacognitive capacities there are? And why does these might challenge our approaches to establish the domain generality of metacognition? As I said earlier, metacognition is the ability to monitor and control one's own cognitive states. How many kinds of monitoring there are? It could be that metacognition is a single domain general capacity, right? A single mechanism, a single resource is in charge of metacognizing all of our cognitive domains. Here are just some examples of them, like perceptual and cognitive and embodied states are all metacognized by the same mechanism. Alternatively, that was supposed to be a brain. Alternatively, an example of intelligence is, of domain general capacities intelligence. And part of why we think it's a domain general capacity is because many things that we do are correlated with each other, right? Working memory, processing speed, pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, creativity. They're highly correlated, suggesting that there is an underlying capacity, sometimes called G, that underlies all these abilities. And if metacognition is like that, if it really is a single resource, then something that we might expect is that behavioral and neural measures are going to be correlated. They're going to look similar when you look at metacognition in, say, perception and metacognition in, say, memory. Whereas if metacognition is a multiple domain-specific ability where there are different, separate, at least to some extent, independent mechanisms that help us introspect, say, perception on one hand and cognitive states on the other hand, and maybe embodied states in the other, then we should have different expectations, right? We should, here's an example. For example, perception, we think of it as domain specific, right? We don't think that our ability to see is correlated, at least not in a very strong sense, with our ability to hear. They interact with each other and whatnot, but, blind people can hear and deaf people can see because they are independent capacities. And if metacognition is a domain-specific ability, we can expect that different mechanisms underlie different abilities to introspect these different states. And therefore, we should be able to find, at least under certain experimental conditions, that the behavioral and neural measures that we use for assessing metacognition in one domain can be non-correlated or independent from those in other domains. Why it matters whether metacognition is domain general or domain specific? I think that there are theoretical reasons of why this matters. On one hand, it is a very important question about the architecture of the mind, right? Like we will learn a lot about how our minds are structured if we decide this question. And it will also tell us what kind of process metacognition is. For example, is it more similar to intelligence or is it more similar to perception? It also has practical consequences. It will allow us to make different kinds of prediction if we knew if metacognition is domain general or domain specific. It might help us training, or we might take different training approaches depending on whether we think it is domain general or domain specific. And it might have huge consequences in clinical cases and how we treat them. If it is domain general and you have an affectation in how metacognition works, it's probably going to be a global issue that needs to tackle in that way. Whereas if it's domain specific, maybe some resources are spared. Now, which is it? Is it domain specific or is it domain general? And the story that I'm going to tell you today is of, it's a messy one. I think the results are quite mixed and we have to, face that and take action as a field. So here's an example of a correlated ability in metacognition where people judge the confidence in a orientation discrimination task and a contrast discrimination task. And it turns out that their metacognition is highly correlated, maybe not very surprising. But this is also true across different perceptual modalities, it seems, like vision, hearing, and touch. If you're good metacognizing in one, you tend to be good in the others and vice versa. One of our own speakers, Sarah Garfinkel, published this paper a few years ago showing that cardiac and respiratory meta-awareness are strongly correlated. And a meta-analysis from a few years ago, collecting several of these papers, show that, yeah, meta-perception seems domain general. And also across domains, across sensory and cognitive domains, there is recent evidence suggesting that if you take memory, semantic knowledge, executive function, general knowledge, like the kind that you might require for answering a trivia, is also correlated across several domains, across several papers, across several methods used. We also found a few years ago using MBPA that the patterns of activity that drive metacognition in different domains, perception and memory in this case, were they were cross-decodable, right? So it was the same pattern or the same code that the brain uses for executed metacognition, regardless of the domain. But we also found that there are a lot of domain-specific patterns of activity that are only decodable within domains, suggesting that even if there is a shared code, there are also very specific mechanisms that each domain is using for assessing metacognition. And this is true in the brain, but also in behavior. These papers, for example, showed correlation in memory and perception in a way that in one paper published in the same journal in the same year showed that there was domain generality. There was a huge correlation between these measures. The other papers showed like absolutely no correlation using very similar tasks. So it seems like it's very tricky to determine whether there is a correlation or not between these measures. Steve Fleming, a few years ago, took prefrontal cortex lesion patients and showed that their metacognition is impaired only in one domain, perception in this case, and it's completely spared in another, memory. Again, very suggestive of a domain-specific metacognitive mechanism. Even within the same domain, there is recent evidence by Kwok and colleagues that if you lesion macaques' brains in different regions, you get differential affectation in metacognition. In one case, metacognition for a temporal task or metacognition of a spatial task. So it doesn't seem, at least in this study, not even within the same domain, there seems to be a correlation. More recently, Sori Srivastava, a student in my lab, took a look at the confidence database and looked for all the multi-domain metacognition studies, which weren't that many, I have to say, which is also an indication that we're not thinking I mean, there are many more that are not in the database. People are thinking about this question, but given how many studies are in the database, this is only a small fraction of them. We found 28 experiments, 33 pairwise comparisons were available, mostly in visual perception and memory, but there was also motor control and inference. And we had like lots of trials and subjects to look at these. And what Suresh found was that, yes, for some studies, there was some correlation across domains. For others, there wasn't any really. And for others, you know, in the same study, some of them were correlated, some of them weren't. And overall, what he found was that, yes, there is some correlation in some studies, but actually, if you look closely and you rule out like some mislabeling or some difficult to interpret results, out of 33 pairwise comparisons, we found one that was like really showing domain generality using a different method that, you know, controls better for noise and things like that. We still found just one domain general ability. And the question is, how do we interpret these, right? So it's very hard to do these tasks because you need to do the same subject within experiment to do both tasks. And, you know, that's time consuming and difficult. So we thought like, why don't we just look at all the memory and all the perception tasks in the database? And there were 112 studies that we could include, more than 7,000 subjects, almost half a million trials. And what we found is that memory metacognition is in general better than perceptual metacognition. This doesn't mean that they are not correlated. It could just be that you're worse at one and better at another, but you know it tracks across subjects. But just in general, when you look at 500,000 trials, it looks like memory, where humans are just better at introspecting their memory than perception, which suggests that there might be some differences. Now, how can we tell if something is domain general? What's the correlation threshold, the person R, let's say, for calling something domain general, right? Does it have to be, you know, like a perfect correlation? Does it, you know, can it be a little bit correlated? Does it have to be like really correlated? And where do we stop taking correlation as an indication of the underlying capacity and we just focus on the numbers that we get? For example, what does it mean that two domains are correlated in 0.09, right? Like what are the actual consequences of having these amounts of correlation? Maybe there are some and, you know, we should study them, but also it seems like a very weak correlation, at least in this one study. And, you know, this is true across the board. And just to be clear, not all correlations that we find are like these. Some correlations are very strong. But the question is like, where do we stop caring kind of for a correlation and when do we really interpret it as being important? The other thing is like domain generality seems to be quite fragile, right? It seems to be really sensitive to type 1 task that is chosen and to an analysis pipeline even, right? Like which measure you use, it might give you one answer or another. It also is fragile in another sense, domain generality. In this study by Ye et al., they found a correlation, a very strong correlation between two domains when they TMS'd at vertex, so there wasn't an expectation of interference. And as soon as they TMS precuneus, they found that the correlation was gone, right? Like a little bit of perturbation created like a strong effect, decorrelating the effect. Now, the other problem with correlations is that I don't know how insightful they are. Sometimes they might be, but for example, vision and audition seem to be very clearly domain-specific mechanisms, right? We don't think of them as being the same mechanism. Of course, they interact, but they're not the same mechanism. And yet, when you test subjects in similar tasks across domains in vision and perception, you find like huge correlations in how they perform, right? So, and of course, this could be observed by other things like intelligence, familiarity, who knows? But the thing is, like, my point is that finding a correlation in and of itself, it's not necessarily informative. It could be, but not necessarily. Now, if metacognition is domain specific, right? Like it's not, there are problems with claiming domain generality, but there are some problems with assessing or determining that metacognition is domain specific too. Because if it is, some almost metaphysical questions emerge. For example, is the number of cognitive mechanisms equal to the number of cognitive capacities? What does it mean to say that it's domain specific? Do we really need a single metacognitive mechanism for every little cognitive capacity that we have? That's, you know, it's possible, but it seems to multiply mechanisms, perhaps unnecessarily. Of course, there could be clustering, right? Like maybe it's domain specific in some way. Maybe all perceptual metacognition is observed by one resource, whereas cognitive domains are subserved by another. But that clustering could be more fine-grained, right? Perhaps, as we showed earlier, contrast and orientation in visual perception are subserved by one metacognitive mechanism, but it's unclear if that same metacognitive mechanism applies for judgments of, say, numerosity or intuitive physics. And the other problem with domain specificity is, like, I just claim that, meta memory seems to be better, but it's unclear why that is. It could be because there are different mechanisms, and the one that we have for memory is better, but it could also be that we're just more familiar with memory tasks. Like, this is what perceptual and memory tasks usually look like. One thing is completely alien to naive subjects, even though I know, you like abort patches, but our subjects typically don't. Whereas remembering words, it's kind of a thing that we do all the time, right? We use our meta memory abilities, at least with these type of stimuli, much more often for memory than for perception. So even though we control for certain things like stimulus properties and performance and things like that, we really don't control much for familiarity with the task, which could be a huge thing, right? Like maybe it is a single domain general mechanism of separate metacognition, but it is not, the stimuli we're giving subjects are very different in terms of familiarity or ease of processing and whatnot, which might affect performance, but that doesn't entail necessarily that they are different resources. So what should we do? I think we should go beyond correlations. Maybe it's a good starting point, but I think we should try to think about these in different terms, trying to get a better measure. We should definitely test beyond vision and memory. I think that many of us are doing it now, and that's great. I think we should do it even more. And we should find more causal evidence too. I think that correlations are great, but being able to show double dissociations, for example, I think that could be a golden standard with lesions, either patients or with animal models. We should be able to do interventions, right? Like if we really think that metacognition is either domain general or domain specific, certain types of interventions should really help us establish these. And I think the one area that has a lot of room for growth is metacognitive training and hopefully transfer. If you want to, how can we train metacognition? Well, if you want to know, I recommend talking to Chrissy Kilgallen, a member of our department who was in my lab and had her poster yesterday. She has a lot of ideas of what we should do for training metacognition and how we should really train attention and teach people to understand cues that they use for assessing metacognition. And some of the things that we may find are that, yeah, metacognition is domain specific and it doesn't transfer across domains, or it might just be that it is super domain general in transfers. And some of the efforts that have been done in recent times, they haven't been super successful, or at least there are widely mixed results out there. So I think that we should invest in trying to train metacognition and show if it transfers, because if it does, it is a huge signal that we're talking about a domain general capacity. And that might look different. It might be across domains. It can be maybe just it only works within domain. It might even be more specific than that. It only works within a single subdomain, like vision or something like that. There are lots of opportunities for us to explore how to think about the nature of these very important mechanisms. And just to conclude, I guess the take-home message is we should take these to heart, this recommendation from this landmark paper, and really focus on studying how monitoring takes in a wide variety of cognitive enterprises. Thank you to my lab, to our funders, and thanks for your attention. I guess we have 5 minutes for Q&A. Matthias and Megan. Yep. No, I think the mic is coming. Yeah. Don't shout at me, Matthias.
So what do you think about the possibility that many of the cases in which you don't have correlations between domains are just explained by measurement noise, right?
Yep.
That you have poor test reliability, and therefore you feel like it seems like there's no correlation when in fact there is a correlation. It's just hidden by noise.
I think you're totally right. I mean, there are recent efforts have tried to increase the number of subjects, the number of trials, which can help with that. We heard yesterday from Dobie that, test retest reliability is something that we don't really have like a good measure for it. He's trying, and other people are trying to develop some, but we don't even know what it looks like. In this case, for example, reliability, it's really a measure across subjects, and the main specificity test is really a within subject question. So we need to find measures of, we need to be sure that our measures are precise, that they are not subject to some inflation. Another thing that we need to face is that some of our best ways of assessing metacognition, let's say meta D prime, for example, it's great, it's not without flaws, but it's a great measure. It really has a lot of assumptions that are not going to work that well when we're doing like trivia questions or when we're assessing things that are really not, we don't have reason to expect there's a Gaussian distribution underlying the and so on. So it is a huge undertaking, and it could all be measurement noise for sure, and we need to do better. Yeah. Oh yeah, Janet has
two comments. Yeah. First of all, I think it's a really important question, because if we're going to take metacognition, maybe we should refer to David on this, but if metacognition really has something to do fundamentally with consciousness, we don't know what to make of metacognition if it turns out to be domain specific. I mean, because our consciousness isn't domain specific, I think. The second thing is that within this, I've done a lot of work within memory metacognition and a little metacognition of agency as well.
Yeah.
And it seems that one of the directions that I think is important is to analyze exactly what people have to do to make these judgments. And that's something that's been going on within psychology a lot. So we need to know what the information is that people are accessing in order to make the judgment that they make. So it may be that components, certain parts of the judgment are domain general, but the information itself on which they're basing the judgments and that they have to access are really necessarily domain specific. So that kind of more fine-grained analysis may be important to forward our thinking about this.
Yeah. I love both comments. With the second one, I was just looking at my student, because that's exactly how we're thinking about it, right? Like, we really need to teach people, for example, for increasing or making metacognition better, we really need to teach people to pay attention to the cues that they can rely on, and they not necessarily are the same. They're probably task specific. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they are heuristics, right? Like, and some of these judgments are quick. Like, you don't have a ton of time to reflect on them. Redirecting attention, I think it's like, or training attention to focus on the things that are going to be more diagnostic. It's very important. And the question about consciousness, I agree. I think it's if it is like really fragmented, as some research may suggest, like, then yeah, we need to think what is its connection to consciousness, if at all. Yeah. Megan, did you have a question? Oh, here you have it. Oh, I think, well, I don't know. Someone else. Someone else should.
Very quick. Thank you, Jorge. My question is a little bit more at the top of the talk, which is like, what is a domain for you and why the brain needs one, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is it? Because sometimes it was modality, sometimes it was something smaller.
Yeah.
So why do we need one?
It's a great question. I mean, it is to a very large extent a metaphysical question about how, what domains there are, like what are the domains that the brain cares about? That's another question, right? Like, for us, we have these categories that we use for designing our experiments and guiding our theorizing. It remains to be seen if those are the domains and borders that the brain actually cares about. I think that we can, in general, think that there are domains. There are like, if you believe in the modularity of the mind, like, you will comfortably say that perception is operating one way, whereas cognition is operating in a very different way. You don't have to carve the space in that way, but I think that there are different, you can carve it in terms of abilities or capacities or types of inputs and whatnot. And I think regardless of how you carve the space, which is, I'm not saying it's trivial or not important, but I think that regardless of how you do it, the question of whether these very important mechanism operates over in the same way over all of those ways of carving our abilities or not, it remains. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Now, I'll just introduce our next speaker, Tony Chang, who's going to talk about tactile introspection.
Okay, thank you very much for coming to our session, and thank you very much for staying. We know there's a strong competitor elsewhere in this building. I'm not sure how good my talk will be, but I've been trying my best to make it a nice bridge between our first talk and the following two talks. So I want to begin with some preliminaries. Other speakers in our symposium are all experimentalists. I'm the only one who is incapable of doing experiments myself. This can mean lots of things. One is that there will be many words on the screen, and please bear with me for the following 20 minutes or so. I know some people don't like it, but it's going to be like this. So concerning the theme of this symposium, there are many questions to begin with. For example, what are the relations between metacognition, self-awareness, introspection, and interoceptions? There was a time in philosophy and psychology when introspection was deemed as entirely problematic. So in philosophy, phenomenologists consider themselves different from introspective psychologists. Behavioralists held that psychology should entirely abandon introspective reports. Recently, introspection has regained its legitimacy to a large extent. It can fail for sure, but it might not be especially problematic compared to other psychological episodes or faculties. So in this talk, I will argue that perspectivalism, the idea that we perceive perspectival spatial properties as well as objective spatial properties, is more defensible in touch than in vision, and tactile introspection provides a more reliable guidance in the relevant domain because introspection provides better signals for touch than for vision. So I want to compare these notions. Before that, consider Stephen Fleming's wonderful book, Know Thyself. Steve specializes in metacognition, which is, quote, the ability to think about our own thinking, end of quote. But even assuming we use cognition and thinking interchangeably, they're still slightly different from knowledge, which requires warrant and justification, at least in the major philosophical tradition. Consciousness and awareness can be even more different. Cognition of objects can be unconscious, and consciousness of things can be non-cognitive, at least according to many. So this is the book. This is the Mandarin translation in Taiwan. So if you read Mandarin, it's 高阶觉察. If we translate back to English, it means higher order awareness. And I think that embodies certain understanding of the translator. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying that it's difficult. And you can, you have a literal translation of Know Thyself, but somehow they make that decision. I say much more about the point here in the previous slides in my book review. So you should read the book. Maybe you can skip the book review, but read the book. Okay, I want to focus on perspectivalism today. In what follows, I will offer a brief defense of perspectivalism in touch and tactile perspectivalism. I will draw heavily on experimental work from the subjectivity lab led up by Jorge and the action and body lab led by Patrick Haggett. So if questions are too difficult, I will either defer to Jorge or many lab members from Patrick's lab. What's perspectivalism? So according to these two authors, Schwenkler and Wechsler, perspectivalism in vision has that visual experiences in a way contains both objective shapes and perspectival shapes to be illustrated later. But our example would be seeing a coin from specific angles, not upfront. And normally we think that the outcome is that we see something like a round shape, not perfect, but round shape. Some people think we also see an oval shape or elliptical shape, and that would be the debate. So these are philosophers subscribing this view. They think we see both perspectival shapes and objective shapes. Some psychologists, I mean, this interpretation is controversial, but you can see that at least some people nowadays think these big names in psychology also hold that view. So anti-perspectivalism. Here's a quote from the paper. We do not literally see perspectival shapes, nor does the ability to recognize, draw, or describe the 2D shape that would occlude an object in one's line of sight depend on a visual experience of any such shape. So that's one characterization of the view. So less philosophers, but still a lot. There's a third view, actually. Philosopher Bishop Berkeley and perhaps many psychologists nowadays seem to believe that we only see perspectival shape. We only see the oval or elliptical shapes when we see a coin. They don't have a name for it. Maybe it should be called anti-objectivism. I think it's quite important to have this third view in view, because in the recent literature, people in philosophy focus on the first two views, but somehow they think the third view is out of the question. But I gather that many psychologists would think the third view or something like a third view is correct. So even if I don't have time today to go into any detail, I think that should be on the table. What's crucial here is that perspectival shapes are not retinal images. None of us think, or none of us should think that we see our retinal images. So perspectival shapes are something like a visual representation that's in our visual systems, right? So there's a further question about whether they are conscious or not. Some people think they are not even, they shouldn't be put, say, in representational terms, or maybe they're representational, but they're not conscious. So those are topics you can find in Jorge's paper and in some of my following slides. So here is the basic setting of his experiment. So in this example, perspectival shapes are elliptical, or sometimes people say it's oval. They're different. And in the paper, they explain why in the experiment they use the term oval, though it's probably misleading. Objective shape here is round, though we know that it's not perfectly round. So the task is to search for the distally oval objects. So there are 4 of them in the middle. The left one is distally elliptical objects. Left 2 is unrotated circular objects. Right one is distally elliptical objects, and right 2 is rotated circular objects. So at the stimulus displayed until response stage, the left-hand side condition is supposed to be easier, while the right-hand side condition might be more challenging, according to perspectivalism. Assuming that, quote, rotated circular objects truly exhibit a representational similarity to distally elliptical objects, they should impair visual search for those objects. So that's the basic idea of the experiment. That is to say, another quote, if a subject must locate a distally elliptical object, they should be distracted by a rotated circle whose projection matches the shape of their target in ways that would cause response time differences. Here are some details. So in the first experiment, they seek to establish the basic conclusion that rotated coins do impair visual search for elliptical objects. Experiment 2 to 4 control for correlated properties and object rotation. Experiment 5 to 6 consider rich dynamic cues with traversing coins and delay responding. Experiment 7 generalizes the result to other shapes such as quadrilaterals. Experiment 8 to 9 use real-world objects under naturalistic conditions. They have some follow-ups, but we're not going to talk about them today. Overall, I think basically they make a solid case for perspectivalism by considering and controlling many potential confounding factors. Of course, that's controversial. We can talk about it later. Okay, there are many follow-ups about this. I'm not going to read them out. So mostly are theoretical criticisms. And I wrote a piece with 2 of my students trying to argue on their behalf against some objections. So the key point here is that in the above discussions, it seems that introspection played no role. And this is interesting as the original discussions since hundreds of years ago have been relying heavily on introspection. In what follows, we will make the case that introspection plays a more important role in supporting tactile perspectivalism. But first of all, isn't the very idea of perspective visual? How can we extend it to other sense modalities? So this might be related to point of view from the keynote speech earlier today. My answer is perhaps not so. Consider this characterization from Adrian Smith. Perceptual experience is perspectively structured when that which is perceived is experienced from somewhere, and here is not restricted to vision. And people do talk about auditory perspectives and tactile perspectives. Consider our wrong coin again, and this time with touch. One can use one's palm to press against it, and in this case, one tactilely perceives its objective shape. But often we touch coins and other objects from all kinds of angles. One way to model perspectival touch is to invoke the tactile field hypothesis. And here I'm heavily relying on works from Patrick's lab. Tactile fields as psychological constructs support computation of spatial relations between individual stimulus locations and thus underlies tactile pattern perception. In other words, perception of individual stimulus locations take place within a tactile field that supports the additional computation of spatial relations between multiple stimuli. So in the parentheses, I said, just like working memory, maybe just like attention. So I want to emphasize that tactile fields here are not receptive fields. So these are psychological constructs. Some people think that in the future, if neuroscience is perfect, we shouldn't have anything like attention, working memory. In that case, maybe we shouldn't have tactile field, but I myself happen to hold certain kind of non-reductionism. I think cognitive psychology will be there forever for good theoretical reason. So tactile fields are not receptive fields if the view is plausible. So in that specific paper, 2011, they investigate perception of large-scale tactile spatial patterns on the hand, arm, and back. I'm not going to talk about any detail, but I'm just showing some pictures of figures they're using. So their targets, their flankers, and there are some virtual lines in relation to those tasks. And you can see that they not only do on your hand, but on your arm, also on your back, and there's a body midline. So basically, there are some advantages in many cases, but if the stimuli cross the body midline, those advantages would disappear. So in one of the following follow-up works, they show that the arrangement of cutaneous receptive fields could allow one to track a stimulus as it moves across the skin, similar to the way animals navigate using path integration. So you can see that there's a path integration demo, and you can see that on the hands, there's an S shape, right? I'm not going to talk about the experiment right now. There's something funny. So path integration somehow has a different name called dead reckoning. And I just realized that in the next episode of Mission Impossible, the subtitle is Dead Reckoning, and I have no idea why that is. I'll figure out maybe next month. These are just more figures I'm not going into. I'm sorry about that, because I just don't have time. Okay, so tactile perspectives and tactile fields. Tactile perspectivalism is the view that tactile experiences have the two aspects of perspectival shapes and objective shapes. Returning to our coin case, often we touch a coin with not only palms, but also fingers and perhaps other parts of the body. Now in tactile pattern perceptions, multiple stimuli constitute complex structures that exemplify varieties of tactile gestalt. In tactile object perception, multiple contact points are involved, and tactile fields facilitate one's tactile perception of the shapes and sizes of the various tactile objects. So these are just statements. I'm not going into any arguments or experimental details. I want to compare third person and first person evidence here. Our tactile object perceptions often, though not always, rely on tactile field effects that help explain why we are normally so effortless when estimating objects' shapes and sizes by touch. This is at least indirect evidence for perspectivalism in touch, because tactile perspectival shapes are taken in order for us to calculate the corresponding objective shapes. The experiment referred above are third-person evidence, but is there any first-person evidence one can rely on here? Because the symposium is on metacognition and introspection. Thank you. So tactile introspection. I believe there is a case to be made for introspection when it comes to perspectival tactile shapes in the following way. Let's say you are blindfolded and somehow pick a round coin up and play with it with one of your hands. You soon realize what the object roughly is and how it feels like. It feels like a round coin with certain weight and thermal properties. Now for vision, there's a certain kind of temporally phenomenological immediacy in seeing the shapes. Immediately or within hundreds of milliseconds, it looks like a round coin, at least in usual cases. However, in the case of touch, this kind of immediacy is often lacking. You pick up something or something dropping on your palm and you begin to explore it. It can take seconds for you to realize what the shape roughly is. Arguably, in the case of touch, perspectival shapes do show up in one's conscious phenomenology. So this is my controversial claim about introspection you can disagree with. Since it normally takes seconds for one to take in shape properties tactilely, the question of conscious perspectival shapes is less difficult to figure out via introspection. Vision, by contrast, often happens so quickly in milliseconds that introspection is less apt for settling the plausibility of perspectivalism in the visual domain. So here are some caveats. The first one, the claim is not that we always pay attention to tactile perspectival shapes. Exactly not. The claim is that through introspection, we know that there is a crucial difference between sight and touch, and this difference influences how we evaluate perspectivalism in these two domains. Second, I have tentatively argued that via introspection, we can find perspectivalism in touch plausible, but that's a claim that you can dispute with. We should do experimental philosophy to test cross-cultural and maybe other kind of subjects with different ages, for example. I only cover one objection. We might be skeptical about the relevance of the tactile field hypothesis. You might ask, even if perspectivalism in the tactile domain can be settled to some extent by introspection in just the way illustrated, it does not require the tactile field hypothesis. Why do we need to introduce it in this context? I think the hypotheses substantiate our understanding of tactile perspectival shapes. Recall the discussion about multiple contrasts and tactile object perceptions. It is true that the point concerning introspection's role in settling tactile perspectivalism and tactile field hypotheses are logically independent, but together they seem to form a cohesive picture of tactile perspectival shapes and tactile objective shapes. Some implications. So different introspective reliability across modalities speaks in favor of heterogeneous domain-specific self-awareness capacity. So I hope this brings back to the first talk. The discussion above contributes to the general idea of broad spectrum introspection. At a very abstract level, introspection might be domain general in the sense that it provides self-knowledge of a wide psychological realm. But at a more concrete level, it is domain specific in that introspection in different domains provides signals with different strengths. So what's introspection? We have no definition. We have definitions from some dictionaries. We have definition in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which are quite similar to most of the dictionaries. Jorge has a paper arguing that introspection is signal detection, and I do encourage you to read the paper as well. Some edited volumes mostly by philosophers, but there are some empirical works in the book that you can check. I'm wrapping up. Okay. So credits. So I have a paper last year talking about covering many points I just talked about. So feel free to refer to it if needed. I want to thank Jorge and Chess Firestone for leading the coin experiment, and we have some follow-ups in Taiwan. I want to thank Patrick Haggett and Antonio Cataldo for guiding me through the relevant tactile field hypothesis. To thank Francesca Frado and Brianna Beck for helping me with that specific experimental work. Phil Sen, who is my current collaborator in Taiwan, and Brown Xie and his lab members in Taiwan, Brain and Consciousness Lab. Also, lots of people from the ICN. This was taken 2016 when I was still there, and I had a really good time. This is not my final slide, but I'm wrapping up. So some advertisement, there's an association called Consciousness Research Network. You might have seen some posters outside. It's much smaller than the ASSC. It was established in 2017, mostly Asian and Australasian based because we're too far away from the world. Here's our official website. You can Google it. And this year, our meeting is the August 26 to 28 in Taipei, and you can still come. Do join us. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Tony. It was a very nice talk. I was just wondering, when you were talking about the implications, how do you measure introspective reliability across sensory modalities?
I see. So
Thank you.
The measurement problem is something I'm not sure about, as you know, given my background. So I offer one trivial reason for my view. The trivial reason is that time is a crucial element here, right? So at least from introspection, given our theme, we know that it takes more than hundreds of milliseconds. So in the case of seeing coins, it's just difficult to figure out whether, in addition to seeing round, whether we also see the elliptical shape. And people also think that introspectively, I don't see round. I see elliptical shape, and I infer that there's a wrong shape. And that's why in philosophy, that kind of discussion can last for hundreds of years. But I think things are relatively cleaner in the case of touch, just because it's slower. And at least in my case, I always feel that even if the shape seen up front is closer to rectangular, say, but if I touch the object from all kinds of angles, I know exactly during this time, in addition to rectangular, I have some information. So the measurement question, I'm not able to answer, but I just answer the introspective part. Thank you.
Hi, Tony, back here. Thank you. Hi, good to see you. Really nice talk. I was just kind of curious if you could talk a little more about comparing the two modalities, in part because you emphasize the role of exploration a lot in touch. And I take it that a lot of what the Gibsonians were trying to do is emphasize the role of exploration in vision as well.
Yes.
And so if you actually allow visual exploration, active vision, do you get a different picture that emerges under those considerations?
Yeah, thank you. I've been thinking about this a lot because in the overall picture, in holding the tactile field view, actually, we want to say that it's more analogous to vision because normally we say we have a visual field, even though people have different views about it. Also, both in sight and in touch, in most cases, we explore things. Even in vision, we see a lot of things. We have saccade and so on. So from the experiments, we normally do so in Patrick's lab. In many cases, we do passive touch. So we just sit there, ask the subject to sit there and have some stimulations. So I think in a way it's analogous because we look around, we have saccade, we explore. So back to your question, can I say more about why this is different in the case of touch? I think in the case of vision, if I stare at, say, my water bottle, especially the cap, I'm not able to control my saccade, but I can stare at it. And immediately or very quickly, I seem to see round and elliptical shape or, something like that. But in the case of touch, say if I'm blindfolded or I'm looking to other direction, if I only do this without any exploration, it will be difficult for me to figure out what the shape is. Maybe I can, do it by top-down inferences. It's probably a bottle. But I think in the case of touch, exploration is slightly more important than in vision. But that's slightly more. Yeah, so it takes longer time, and there are upsides and downsides. Upside is introspection play better role. Downside is it takes more time, so it's less efficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah. That's... no, I'm not sure which one is correct. So I don't.
Oh, yeah, I think so. Then you just need to click there and good, right?
Yeah. No. Let's try with it. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, now we have Lisa Filevich with different metacognitive paradigms.
Yeah. Yeah, my original title was inexplicably long, sorry, so I just changed it. And I also want to use the mic to broadcast a message. I just realized I lost my wallet and my phone. If somebody finds a green bag with phone, yeah, science is more important. We'll figure it out. Okay, so as Jorge already said, as a field, we have been studying metacognition vastly using a very restricted paradigm where we ask participants to rate confidence following discrimination response. Yeah. Wait. Is that better? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we ask participants often to rate confidence following discrimination responses, and we use this restricted paradigm to ask about perception, memory, or in our case, motor metacognition. I personally think this is an excellent approach, but a broader reading of the literature will quickly reveal that this is not the only paradigm that's used to measure metacognition. So sometimes people use just subjective ratings. For example, agency ratings, tip of the tongue reports, mind-wandering reports. These paradigms are also often used and sometimes considered to be metacognitive. More broadly, sometimes people don't care so much about metacognitive monitoring itself, but instead care about metacognitive control, essentially how efficiently or how well we can control our behavior based on our metacognitive knowledge. And this is a case, especially in education, which I've been thinking quite a lot recently. And so, of course, I know that we all know here that paradigms matter, that different paradigms measure different things, and we might not expect to see exactly the same results. So I'm going to try to go beyond just the simple message of saying different paradigms are different, but I'm going to help to explore the diversity of metacognition, not so much as Jorge focused on the different domains, but a little bit more on the dimension of diversity of paradigms. However, I hope that by the end of my talk, you agree with me that these two things are not completely orthogonal dimensions as I represented them here. They really are very linked. And also, I think it's important to talk about this because in the field, I think we're guilty of jingle-jangle fallacies. This is a term I embarrassingly only learned very recently, but jingle fallacies are those where we assume that two different cognitive functions are the same just because they have the same name. Jangle fallacies are the opposite. Okay, so let's start with the basic paradigm that we often use here in this field, where we ask participants to first discriminate and between two possibilities and then rate their confidence. As Jorge said, this is, I think it was Jorge, this is excellent because it gives us the best of two worlds. We don't need to stick to a strict behaviorist tradition where we only ask about about behavior and care only about button presses. And because we do care about subjective report and deeply so, but we don't want to trust subjective report because we know it can be fallible. So this paradigm allows us to link the two and ask essentially about the precision of subjective report. And it's this advantage or this approach that we thought might be interesting and useful for the study of agency. And so for those of you who might not know, so agency is this feeling that it is I who move my body and I am in control of my body and through my body, the environment around it. And agency is generally studied in the following way. I ask somebody to move, I manipulate the consequences of their movement, and then I ask them, how much control did you feel? And then I just take that rating and just have to take it at face value. To escape that reliance on subjective report, sometimes we measure agency through implicit measures, asking about intentional binding. This relies on the perceived timing of events. But so we thought perhaps metacognitive measures, because they give us this best of two worlds, they might allow us to get rid of these two extremes. So, and this, by the way, we're not the first ones to say it. We agreed with a paper that had been published from, I think, Hagwon group. So, together with Angeliki Sharampaki, who's a PhD student in my lab, we tried to use metacognitive methods to ask some questions that she had about agency. And she said, well, look, agency studies, in research in agency, we tend to just modify and alter the feedback that people get about what happened after they moved, about the consequences in the external world. But why are we ignoring this crucial part, the embodied predictions and what people really expect to happen when they move, what people expect to happen with their body? So the idea was to test for, or to try and compare tactile manipulations, so violations of tactile expectations and agency compared with other kinds of manipulations. And so we wanted to go beyond the just asking about different, so subjective report in different conditions. We wanted to use a measure that we can align on the same axis, and that is M ratio, because we can ask about the precision of subjective ratings in the case of agency. So, just to say, I don't know, Tony, if this is going to answer your question specifically, but it might hint to your hypothesis. So in order to test or to compare tactile violations of agency against other kinds of manipulations, Angeliki paired up with Anthony Siston, who was a research assistant in the group, and they built a really cool device. They 3D printed sinusoidal gratings on little discs that then they built on a wooden box. Inside the wooden box, there were a couple of motors that could be controlled with Arduino, so they could rotate independently. Participants placed their hands here on the wooden box, sat behind this occluder and looked at a screen that showed two different orientations. The task, and a little bit more concretely, looked like this. Participants placed their hands on this wooden box, and what you can see here, I don't know. Sorry. Okay, give me a moment. Recap. Okay, no point. So what you can see there on the hands are just 3D motion capture sensors. We use these sensors to move a hand on a screen so that we can move the hand on a screen simultaneously and in line with participants' hand movement. This is in the rightmost. You see a picture of me doing the experiment. I'm with my hand there on the wooden box behind an occluder, and I'm looking at the screen with the two little discs and the hand moving. The hand displayed on the screen and the real hand the hand displayed on the screen could be manipulated in one of three different ways. We could add a spatial manipulation where there was an angular deviation between the real hand and the virtual one, a temporal delay, or a tactile mismatch between what participants really felt on the rotated disc or what they saw on the screen. Angeliki tested participants on two different tasks. In the agency task, she first told them which of two orientations they had to touch, and participants made a goal-directed movement and explored for a very short while the orientations on the discs. And then what participants saw on the screen could be manipulated in one of these three possible conditions. Participants then simply rated how much agency they felt over that movement. So what you can see here is that with increasing magnitude of manipulation, participants rated lower agency. This makes sense. This is what we expected, but we expected it especially for the temporal and spatial manipulations which had been shown in the field. This importantly validates the manipulation as one possible way in which we can also alter participants' sense of agency when we introduce a violation in their tactile expectations. Now, the problem with this is that we can't directly compare the three different conditions because they might be subjective to biases. So what Angeliki did was also ask the same participants to complete a metacognitive agency task. Participants here made two movements, first movement, second movement. One of the two was shown on the screen without any additional manipulation. Participants, the other one was manipulated. Participants had to rate whether they felt more or less control over the second interval relative to the first, and then rate confidence. Here, I show you D prime, mean confidence, and M ratio. Let's look at the rightmost result where I show the M ratio results. And let's focus on the green dots, which are the crucial tactile manipulation. We see that tactile manipulations were in fact comparable to others. Participants were metacognitively similarly, at least indistinguishably precise in detecting tactile violations. You can also see that there's a slightly higher M ratio for the spatial manipulations. That's a little bit difficult to interpret, given that we also have, if you see on the left, the slightly lower D prime. So we have to be careful about that. But in principle, this shows not only that we can induce violations of agency, but that participants can detect them with equal precision. Now, there's a lot to say about the implications for the measurement of tactile predictions in agency. And for that, I encourage you to look at to visit Angeliki's poster this afternoon. I just want to focus on the metacognitive side here. And for that, I want to show that this one last result. What is it that we're measuring when we measure metacognition of agency? So can we replace agency ratings by metacognitive ratings, given that apparently they have an advantage that allows us to compare across conditions? Well, if they were the same thing, if we're measuring the same thing when we ask for tactile M ratio and agency ratings, we should see a negative slope, a clear negative slope between M ratio and agency ratings. That's because a participant who has a very very steep slope, who very quickly experiences a loss of agency, should also have a very strong subjective experience, and therefore give very high confidence very quickly when they correctly detect a manipulation. When we plot this relationship across all three conditions, we see that by and large there is a tendency for a negative relationship between these two. This is fine. This is what we expected, and we should have been worried if there hadn't been this trend. But in no case was this significant. So we conclude from here that while M ratio and agency judgments are related, they're not quite the same. So now this leads us to the, I think, important question of, well, if they're not the same, how are they different? Luckily, we have an answer to that question. This is work we did with Marika Constant, who's also here, but presenting something completely different. And it's work we did a couple of years ago, and it's been published last year. So I'm going to go very, very quickly through it. But I think it's an important message. Marika, in her studies, asked participants to also do, as Angeliki did, two different tasks, a metacognitive task and an agency task. The movement was not a hand reaching movement, but instead a finger flexion. And we measured the movement with this little thing you see on the picture. It's a leap motion tracker. So it's an infrared camera that allows us to measure, to measure the hand and also display it on the screen in real time. And so Marika asked participants to do first a metacognitive task where participants made one movement, one finger flexion, and then another finger flexion. One of the two was presented without any additional manipulation, just as we measured it with our leap camera. And the other one had an additional delay. The agency task was also just a single finger flexion that could be shown on the screen with a delay or not, and participants just rated their sense of agency. Sorry, I forgot to say in the metacognitive task, participants first discriminated which of the two intervals they felt more agency on, and then rated their confidence. So our question was computational. We wanted to know whether it was the same or with the same computational mechanisms that underlie confidence ratings could also be taken to underlie agency ratings. In order to do that, we exploited the known properties of confidence ratings that depend on the noise of the internal signal distribution. So in order to test this question, so Marika tested participants with two different conditions that we call low noise and high noise. Low noise was just a hand that was relatively easy to see on the screen. And the high noise condition was much more difficult to see. The real manipulation was on the visibility of the stimulus on the screen, but we call it a noise manipulation. So in order to test that it's okay, that our claim makes sense, we first need to check that the visibility manipulation behaves as expected. We saw first that that's the case in the confidence task. So we see that in the high noise condition here in blue, participants had lower accuracy in the discrimination task, and also a smaller difference in confidence between correct and incorrect trials as compared to the low noise condition. Also in the agency task, we expected to see a shallower slope. Essentially, we expected to see less extreme agency ratings across the board. This is exactly what we see. So adding noise seems to, or changing the visibility of the stimulus seems to behave in the way we expected it to behave. Okay, I have to hurry. Then now the question was, as I said, computational. So that means that we wanted to test which of two, or we wanted to compare or try to identify which computational mechanisms could best account for two different ratings, confidence ratings and agency ratings. And we contrasted two possible models, one that we derived from the confidence literature, where we modeled rating as dependent on the probability of having given a correct response given the internal signal. That's a second order model here on the left. And the defining characteristic of those kinds of ratings is that they depend on the noise of the internal distribution. We also modeled a first order model where we modeled ratings not as the probability of being correct, just as a distance from the criterion. This magnitude does not depend or does not vary with the noise of the distribution. So when we combine those two models with our noise manipulations, this boils down to having two possible models where that differ in their criterion placements. So all this does is that in the second order model, we have criteria that are assumed, this is a strong assumption, they're assumed to be equidistantly placed on probability space, whereas on the first order model, they're assumed to be equidistantly placed on the internal signal axis. And so these two different models make different predictions in terms of a number of trials that fall into each bin. To cut a rather long story short, we find that the confidence ratings could be best explained by the second order model here in yellow with a lower BIC here on the left of these two plots. On the other hand, agency ratings could be best explained by a first order model in purple with the lower BIC. So I think this rather strongly suggests, at least to me, that confidence models can only poorly account for agency ratings. And I think this means that they're computationally and perhaps also therefore conceptually different. Agency ratings might be better understood as reports of first order information. And so the last thing I want to do is talk about the dissociation between metacognitive monitoring and control. Here, as maybe you've noticed, that basically I've been presenting paradigms where we do motor metacognition. We ask participants to move and then ask them metacognitive questions about this. So what we have is not just first and second order performance, we also have zero order performance. And in this situation, we can draw links and try to understand the dissociations between second order and zero order performance. That means we can ask the question of whether people who know how well they move are also better at moving. Can they, what's the relationship between metacognition and expertise? I think that motor tasks are a pretty interesting platform or way to ask this question. And so the problem that we have is that the movements that I just described, finger flexions and hand movements, are not very rich, and they're difficult we can't really measure performance. How good are people at flexing a finger? So in order to answer this question, Polina Arbutsova analyzed data from a task that she had collected some time ago on the Skittles task. Some of you might know the Skittles task. It's virtual. So in our case, it's a virtual version of a real world game. In the real world game, participants hold a ball that's hanging from a rope from the top of a post, and they have to swing their arms to throw a ball around the post to hit the target that's standing behind it. In our virtual version of the game, participants place their forearms on that metal bar, horizontal bar, that can pivot along the here on the elbow, and they can extend and flex their elbow and open their hand when they want to release the ball. When they release the ball, they see the ball flying on the screen, and they see this on the screen. That blue thing is the pole. The red dot is the target standing behind it, and participants see the ball that they're grabbing and their forearm or the horizontal metal bar. So Paulina had tested this on 2 different tasks. So she had squeezed this motor task into a metacognitive task, and she had asked participants to discriminate either between 2 trajectories, which of 2 trajectories best matches the one they did, or between 2 angles, which of 2 angles best matches the one where their hand was at the point of release. I want to just point out the main difference between these 2. The trajectories task asks about the distal property, so about the distal effects after movement, and the angles task asks about the proximal property of the movement. So I'm going to skip through this, sorry, but crucially what Paulina found is that when we try to relate type 2 and type 0 performance, so essentially M ratio and performance on the motor task, that means that we measure that as the proportion of trials where the participant hit the ball, we find that when participants when we measure M ratio on the trajectories task, there doesn't seem to be a relationship. Participants that are good metacognitively are not better at moving. On the other hand, this is different when we look at M ratio of your own body. So when participants are good at monitoring the fine details of how they actually move their body, not the following consequences of that, there seems to be a relationship with how well they move. So to wrap up, I've shown you an example in which we used a metacognitive paradigm instead of simple subjective report, and we just used it as a tool to ask another interesting question in a rather different field. Now, it's important to say that those things are not replaceable. So metacognition of agency, in our particular case, is different than agency. And I think, although it's a very useful tool, we should not conflate these things. I also drew a dissociation between metacognitive monitoring, metacognitive control. And it's not as simple as saying these 2 things are always related or never related, they're just different. In some cases, they might be and not. And so I think more generally, I think it's important to first avoid jingle-jangle fallacies, but it's also useful to exploit them. In our case, it has been a rather fun way to push forward. And also finally, I just added this because I often get the question like, oh, okay, because you say that something is metacognitive, then nobody else can call something metacognitive. So is metacognition only valid if we use confidence following discrimination? Well, no, I don't know who gets the name, who gets to claim the name metacognition, but I think it's very important to be aware of these terminological distinctions. Thank you.
Thanks, Elisa. That was great. I'm interested in the agency and confidence model. So it seems like there's a bit of a unfair playing field there, seeing as for confidence, you have this strong computational notion of probability correct, and then you can put it into an SDT space. Whereas it feels like the space of possible agency computations is larger. So I'm just wondering whether you can think of other agency models that might go beyond the SDT model that might capture the data even better.
You mean models of agency that also incorporate noise and that they're...
Yeah, it's something that just goes beyond the notion of probability correct. So I'm just wondering whether it's qualitatively different and you need a different type of modeling framework to capture it.
Absolutely. So I don't think we were claiming that. So we weren't looking for a model for agency ratings. We were trying to draw a distinction between how 2 very similar ratings behave very differently. And I think it's just trying to emphasize that distinction. I hope that's clear. But yeah, you're right. We don't have a model of agency rating.
But did the distance model, even though it lost, sorry, if it won for agency, was it a good fit to the data, the distance?
I think so, yeah, good enough. So yeah, yeah, absolutely. It wasn't nonsense. Yeah.
So the shout. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if for your tactile prediction, do you think this tactile prediction has gone the same way as the spatial and temporal, which are directly linked to separate information? And this tactile is something you kind of learn during the task itself. Maybe it has a kind of different prediction weight than the other 2.
I think I didn't understand fully. So let's talk a little bit more. I don't see why the tactile would be more learned during the task than the other two. In fact, if anything, it should be more intuitive.
Going in that direction or the right time, we get additional information about that. And these tactile grading is something that we're not, and you learn you're not always right. So maybe your prediction would be kind of different in that space.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your point. Let's talk about it later.
Okay, thank you. Okay, our last speaker, Sarah Garfinkel, on the divergence between interoceptive accuracy and interoceptive awareness in autistic individuals. Take it away.
Hi, so as a researcher who does primarily clinical research, I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction, but many thanks to the last three speakers for their elegant talks. So sensory processing, we have exteroceptive senses like vision and audition, which can help us navigate the world. But we also have interoception, which is an internal sense. It's a relatively recent sense, identified only initially by Sherrington in 1906. And there have been many debates recently about how best to define it. A white paper was formed from researchers a few years ago where we came up with this shared definition. Interoception refers to the process by which the nervous system senses, interprets, and integrates signals originating from within the body, providing a moment-by-moment mapping of the body's internal landscape across conscious and unconscious levels. And there's still a big debate in the literature about what actually constitutes an internal sense. And I recently wrote this review article with Camilla Nord and Tix, and no one could agree about what constituted an interoception sense. So I couldn't agree with Camilla, the editor couldn't agree, and the reviewers couldn't agree. So to get around it, we did this traffic light table to simply reflect the debates in the literature, with green being the most agreed within the literature, amber being more debatable, and red still being accepted by some, but still maybe more contentious. And my particular research will focus on the heart here. And it's done primarily in individuals on the autistic spectrum. As you all know, autistic individuals display difficulties in understanding their own emotions and emotions in others. And anxiety is also very highly comorbid in autism, and really the results are really striking. So in the literature, they'll say 23 to 60%. The neurobehavioral clinic that I was attached to in Brighton, we were seeing much higher than 60% of autistic adults also with an anxiety condition. So there really was something about the two which were somewhat entwined. And sensory changes are also often seen in autism. Actually, the first definitions of autism had sensory changes as fundamental. They sort of got displaced with theory of mind taking over, and only now are they coming in focus as actually something which could be fundamental to helping understand this condition. And the research to date has focused largely on senses like thermoception, kids playing in the cold. They don't know it, or they don't sense the cold and feel the pain of it. Texture, which can often actually guide food preferences, which are often influenced by texture. Audition, being overwhelmed by loud noise, and vision, sometimes being fascinated by beautiful light. So people can be both hyper and hyposensitive in a pleasant or a aversive way. And actually, it's a very individualistic thing. These sensory changes aren't uniform, and actually clinicians will often build up sensory profiles which are very specific to the individual in question. Interestingly, the interoception sense has been historically largely ignored in this group, but actually is growing in its focus specifically in regard to autism. And the insular cortex is known to be involved in interoception. This has been shown many, many times. I have here the seminal study by Hugo Critchley showing that when people are detecting their heartbeat, then the insula in terms of its function and also its structure is related to interoceptive accuracy, how accurate people are at detecting their hearts. And this is also of interest because when looking at autistic individuals, there's often changes that you see in the insular cortex, specifically in regard to reduced functional connectivity of the insula. So this key region that we know to be fundamental for interoception also has aberrant connectivity and activity in autistic individuals, suggesting that interoception may be changed in sub-individuals. And then clinical manifestations of autism, it's interesting to see that there are patterns of behavior which often map onto changes in interoception. So some autistic individuals will forget to eat. Maybe they're just not getting the hunger cues in the same way. And others may overeat, like they may love a type of food and will just carry on eating it, and maybe then they're not getting the fullness sensations in the same way. So these two behaviors, forgetting and overeating, could also be seen in this sort of dampen down of interoceptive signals framework. But then in contrast, in the clinic, we were also very aware that autistic individuals would often hyper-report somatic symptoms in the body. So they would really talk about them a lot, about what was going on in this body, in their bodies, which is kind of intriguing because it suggested that maybe there was heightened interoception, or at least heightened reports of interoceptive awareness in this group. And how can we reconcile this with the reduced accuracy or precision that seems to manifest in some of their behaviors? So in order to probe this experimentally, sorry, this thing is going haywire. So in order to probe this experimentally, we performed what was at the time, and it's a few years ago now, the first study of interoceptive accuracy in autistic adults. So at this initial study, we just used a very simple heartbeat perception test. Individuals just silently counted their heartbeats over a specified time frame, and we could look at how many heartbeats they reported relative to how many they actually had. And in this paradigm, that served as a measure of interoceptive accuracy. And then we could also look at self-report measure to look at the sort of subjective awareness. And we used the Porges Body Awareness Questionnaire for this. And this had questions like, during most situations I'm aware of, for example, how hard my heart is beating. They would then do a sliding a Likert scale of never to always, a bloating feeling, never to always, and other sensations as well. And this initial study that showed in terms of interoceptive accuracy on this heartbeat perception test, there was a significant group difference, with autistic adults performing significantly worse at the group level. But I kept in the individual data points, so you can see that this wasn't uniform. There were some individuals who had this deficit and some didn't. This is, of course, compatible with how we know sensory changes may be in some individuals and not others, and it's specific to the individual in question. And this just says that interoception, in terms of interoceptive accuracy, may be a sense that is reduced in some autistic individuals. But strikingly, this contrasted with this interoception self-report measure, where we ask people how aware you are of interoceptive bodily sensations. And actually, at the group level, the autistic individuals would say they're very, very aware. And we Z-scored these values and subtracted them, so we could see how much more people said they were aware relative to their actual accuracy. And this correlated with individual differences in anxiety. So if people said they were very, very aware, but they had reduced accuracy or precision, then their anxiety was higher. So this led to the hypothesis that could we increase interoceptive accuracy, and if so, can we reduce anxiety? And we actually registered this as a clinical trial. So this was a clinical intervention. But For the crowd here, there's also a secondary interesting question about what happens to interoceptive awareness. So we can make people more accurate. Do we see changes in awareness as well, and in what direction? So in terms of this clinical trial, it was a pre-registered clinical trial in 120 autistic individuals where we gave them interoceptive training to make them more accurate. I'll describe the procedure in a second. We call the interoception training group AD for short, so aligning dimensions of interoception experience. And we also gave these individuals a brain scan before and after, and we wanted to see their changes in anxiety, that resulted from the changes in interoception and also the neurocircuitry that may also change with interoceptive training. And we contrasted this to an active control group, which was an extraceptive training condition. Autistic individuals will often say they feel anxious because they don't know the emotion that the person's conveying to them when they're speaking. They find it hard to recognize emotions in others. So we taught them emotional prosody, so enhanced recognition of the emotion embedded in the way people are speaking. And that served as an active extraceptive training condition that would also ideally reduce their anxiety. So when it comes to measuring interoceptive accuracy, there are limitations of this task. So higher order knowledge of heart rates when just counting your heart rate may influence people to give approximately the right number of heartbeats, especially if we're trying to train people in interoceptive accuracy. It's not a good test to use. They may just learn to count at a particular rate with limited interoception guiding their counting rates. So we wanted a better control that would overcome that particular limitation. So another task that's been used in the literature is one which depends on judging the synchronicity of tones in relation to heartbeats. So in a trial, there are 10 beeps, and these beeps are either exactly in sync with your heartbeat or they're just time shifted off. And the temporal information of those beeps is the same, irrespective of whether they're in sync or out of sync. So no higher order knowledge of heart rate can guide correct decisions on this particular task. However, this is a much harder task. As you can see, it's based on internal, external integration. It's training other processes as well. So we really wanted to train on both, including the first one, which even though it has limitations, is actually one based on interoceptive focus. So for the training, we got people initially to do light exercise. That's because interoceptive accuracy is both a state and a trait phenomenon. It's trait in the sense that here at rest in the lecture hall, if I were to measure your interoceptive accuracy, some people would be very, very accurate at rest and some people wouldn't be at all. It's a really interesting individual difference that differs so much in people. But it's also a state phenomenon in the sense that if I got you all to do 50 star jumps, you then become much more accurate, the signal becomes stronger. So we use light exercise so people have interoceptive feedback, they can feel their heartbeat more strongly. We then give them, again, these straightforward cardiac tests, the silent counting of the heartbeats, judging whether tones are in sync or out of sync with your heart. And then we give people extraceptive feedback, just saying whether they are correct or incorrect. And what happens is their heart rate returns back to baseline. So the signal gets fainter, but people are still able to stay within this interoceptive channel and learn to be more interoceptively accurate. When we test people at baseline and the final session, we do no exercise manipulation, so everything's done at rest. And our extraceptive training was just playing repeatedly different types of sentences said in different emotional ways and training them to have better precision over the emotional prosody content of the sentences and giving them extraceptive feedback for that. As this was a clinical trial, anxiety was our primary outcome variable. And we've now published this in eClinical Medicine, which is the open access version of the Lancet. And we got significant differences. This is the published data where we did observe clinically significant differences in anxiety. But what we haven't published yet, and I'm delighted to report, is that we unblinded this in terms of the 1 year follow-up, and the results remain after 1 year, which we're so happy about. We also had a registered threshold that we predefined about what counted as recovery within this clinical trial. Of course, recovery is a complex thing, but this was our threshold, which was a 6-point drop on a 20-point scale as clinically meaningful, and it had to be below a certain threshold. And according to this predefined criterion, we found that roughly a third of our individuals in our Introspective training group met this criterion relative to half in the control group. And then this is the slide that I really wanted to present to you, because this is the one that I think about a lot, which is we, over and beyond the clinical intervention in terms of the drop in anxiety, we were able to see an increase in interoceptive accuracy. We're using D prime here on the in-sync, outer-sync decisions, and this is a very hard task, but we were able to see increases in interoceptive sensitivity using this measure in our training group specifically. But then the intriguing thing is this self-report measure where people say, how aware are you of bodily and interoceptive sensations? This dropped in our interoceptive training group. And this was not what we predicted. It fits the anxiety findings, which was shown to be the discrepancy in those two measures. But we see here that enhancing the accuracy and the precision of this interoception process seems to drop these overall awareness measures. We also saw changes in functional connectivity in the insula. Again, this is this key interoceptive region. And we were able to see with interoceptive training, enhanced functional connectivity between the right insula and the BMPFC area. So linking to an area involved in autonomic control. And we also saw enhanced left insular connectivity with this area of the ACC, which is another area in the brain that represents arousal. So my interpretation of that is we also have increased coherence of arousal signal in brain with this interoceptive training. Very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, some participants also described their experiences, which I think are interesting for future hypothesis formation. So one individual reported a reduction in extraceptive sensory overload. So they said as the inner channel gets clearer, the outer channel gets more quiet. And it seems that maybe they felt overwhelmed by senses in the environment because they didn't have good precision into internal senses. And when you're able to make this stronger, it maybe acted as a bit of a seesaw and helped dampen down the outside world. Someone else said, when I notice the impacts of anxiety in my body, I'm more aware of them and I'm able to reassure myself that it's just a physical reaction. I'm better at taking deep breaths and trying to slow my breathing and heart rate down rather than letting it spiral. So better interoceptive accuracy gave earlier access into these signals, allowing for better regulation. And then in terms of domain specific and transference, I thought this was an interesting point. I believe it's increased my awareness of hunger, and as a result, I remember to eat, drink, go to the toilet. But again, that's also interesting because these are adaptive functions which seem to be enhanced relative to this general awareness measure that seems to be reduced. So is there something about increasing the precision of meaningful signals and dampening down the noise that happens with increased interoceptive accuracy? So to conclude, increased interoceptive awareness ascertained via this self-report measure, and I completely take the point that we use awareness in many different ways. This is the way we've quantified it clinically in this study, and reduced interoceptive accuracy are observable in autism. Interoceptive accuracy training reduces anxiety, increases interoceptive accuracy, and this self-report measure of awareness is reduced. What that's tapping into, I think, is mechanistically interesting and needs to be understood more. And very speculatively, I wonder whether there's something about interoceptive surprise that happens when people don't have good precision into what their body is doing, and increasing the accuracy in the brain-body mapping potentially serves to cancel out that interoceptive surprise, stopping these things sort of rising to awareness in everyday functioning. Thank you to Hugo Critchley. I was in his lab for my postdoc training and further, and he was an amazing mentor. And Lisa Quat, who was a postdoc on this work, who worked so hard doing the clinical trial, the rest of the lab, and thank you all for listening.
Yeah, that was great. I was wondering if you stratified your subjects according to severity of autism, because there's some ideas that, I mean, it's very heterogeneous. Yeah. And it seems that some of the lower functioning autistic people, higher functioning autistic people seem to have, more self-awareness maybe than controls, and the lower functioning ones have less. And then in terms of like perception, lower functioning autistic people have, better perception for, small things, details and whatnot. So I was just wondering, that's one question. And then the other one is, this isn't, I mean, the core deficits of autism, anxiety seems to be like a secondary thing. It's not a core deficit. So I mean, I'm not denying that is found often, but it's more of a secondary thing. It's not a unifying thing at the bottom level, which is more like a theory of mind and executive control and central coherence deficits.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So just because of the nature of the training, people were quite high level in this, but actually we had 3 nonverbal people. I mean, they chose to be nonverbal. They clearly were high functioning, but they were nonverbal and they performed just as well. And it helped them. There was no sort of difference in them, but we didn't quite have the range to stratify it, like you say. But we're actually piloting now with much more severe children to see if we can help kids sort of further down on the autism spectrum, or whether it's applicable to them. And actually it seems like it may work, but that's very early days. Regarding your second point about anxiety not being woven in, I think that probably is true, just because there's very few unifying things that bring autism together. And actually the initial data that shows this interoceptive deficit did only manifest in some. So I think you probably are right. We see it in an awful lot of individuals, but maybe it is in those individuals who have more interoceptive impairments. And yeah, and that's not everyone. I think the sensory changes are pretty core. And I think sensory changes are core, but the domain that it manifests in is individual. And this is just one of the senses it may manifest in.
Thanks, Sarah. That was really great. I was wondering when you get the mechanism of this link between increased accuracy and reduction in awareness by looking at any lagged effects within individuals. So is it the case that if you initially increase your sensitivity, that you then show more of an awareness decrement next time around?
It's such a lovely question, and that makes me really happy, because we didn't look awareness all the way through, and we did it as a sort of pre-post measure. But actually because we're about to potentially launch this in kids, then actually this gives a scope to do awareness checks throughout, with the potential for interesting modeling to look at that. So I can't answer it, but I'm so pleased you asked it. And we'll think about including that. So thank you.
That was a lovely talk. That was amazing. I have a question about the last slide where you had sort of these anecdotal reports. I found it pretty amazing that you trained on a very specific interoceptive task, and you listed earlier like a dozen different ways we can intercept, and it seems like this specific training is generalizing to these other domains. Do you think it's a real thing? Do you want to follow it up? Do you have plans about that?
So I think we definitely want to use this as inspiration for making more formal testing of these principles. So more formal testing of extraceptive sensory profiles to see if they change, and more formal testing of transference to other senses. So that's in the future based on these reports to look at that more systematically.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to come up, and we're going to have extra 15 minutes of discussion guided by more questions, maybe about the general topic of the symposium, about metacognizing across domains, but yeah, anything that is on your mind will be great. Does anyone want to start?
Yeah, I mean, to put it just super generally, any thoughts about metacognition of metacognition? So, you know, people might be monitoring their mental states, or there might be just making things up, or otherwise failing to genuinely be monitored. I mean, this theme came up in the Garfinkel talk, and I was really interested in the sort of way to correct for that. But maybe with Jorge, I mean, so even if metacognition is domain specific, couldn't it still be that metacognition of metacognition is domain general? So there's some sort of, you know, whether I'm metacognizing as opposed to confabulating or doing something else, maybe there's some general capacity at this kind of higher order level. Curious about that. Partly as a matter of setting up the debate, and then, you know, is this a real possibility or not?
Yeah. Sorry, do you want to say something about the last? Oh, formidable. Yeah, I don't know. That is a really interesting possibility. That you know, in the lab at least, like we ask subjects to give ratings, and they're gonna press buttons. Whether what they are doing, it's unclear sometimes. I've argued in the past that one advantage of using confidence ratings over subjective ratings is that they're a little bit more, they're clearer, right? When you say, please rate your confidence, this is something that at least some people have done before. It's more intuitive. It's like, you don't have to explain as much what you're asking, whereas subjective ratings, for example, sometimes is like, maybe only if you're into consciousness or qualia or something like that, you get. That said, it does, yeah, it's totally possible that in some cases, you know, people just say things. Recently, a Fantasia, for example, individuals who discovered that they actually don't have like mental imagery say like, oh, I was always like repeating what other people were saying. I didn't know it was like, it wasn't metaphorical. Like, I don't know if this sense of knowing oneself can be also like that. The second part of your question, like, can there be like a meta cognitive capacity? Yeah, I guess that's an interesting question. Like maybe that should have been like in the slide of like other things to test, right? Like, do you in general consider that you know these things well? And I don't know if there has been work done on that. I mean, some people ask about global capacities and things like that, but yeah.
Sorry, yeah, there's a meta paper, so confidence on confidence. That's from Samuel Recht, who's around here, I know, and Pascal Marmasian, I think. So yeah, talk to them, it's really cool. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for the wonderful talk from all the speakers. And I kind of have a general question. So if we consider like a binding problem or multimodal integration for perception, and we kind of consider like we have a multi-modal but low-dimensional feature integrate into a high-dimensional, maybe space or embedding. Can we also consider like multimodal metacognition like this way? So we may have a low feature dimension and low feature low feature metacognition, but when we are doing binding or something, then if we ask their metacognition for several features at the same time when they are at the response stage, do you think their like reaction time will be additive, linear additive to the how many features of the metacognition you are asking, or they can be integrated together? So I think this is a kind of general question, whether it's general or domain specific.
No, this is too scientific for me to answer, so please.
I can give it a go. So a couple of years ago in that paper that you mentioned by Nathan Favre and it's in Journal of Neuroscience, we tried to answer that question. We tried to ask whether confidence gets integrated as two separate confidence ratings that then form as a multimodal one, or whether you just have a confidence on a multimodal stimulus. I don't think we had a definite answer for that. It looked like for different participants, it could look slightly different. So I think I agree with a good question, but we don't have an answer yet.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Fascinating work and talks. I wanted to broaden even further the spectrum of introspection and ask you for your thoughts on something that's introspection directed towards contents that are neither extrasensory nor interoceptive. So I do a lot of work on mind wandering and spontaneous thought. And we know from that work that about 30 to 50% of consciousness or mental stream is not about the here and now, including the here and now that's interoceptive. So I just wonder, how do you see introspection and how does your work relate? What can we learn from your work about this sort of introspection that's directed to contents that are not, that are sourced in a simulative fashion, rather the sensory fashion?
I mean, I can say something about that just in terms of one of the difficulties of measuring metacognition, and one of the reasons I think the field has focused a lot on memory and perception, especially visual perception, is that to some extent it's easy to measure, right? Like you can have 1,000 trials, you present 1,000 Gabor patches, and you control, you know exactly what's going on, what the stimulus is, and so on. The types of mental events that you're describing are fascinating, and we, as you said, we experience them all the time. And it also presents some challenges in terms of how to test it in the lab, how to elicit those episodes in ways that are controllable, that the experimenter have controls over them. But I love the idea of like expanding, obviously, the research to that. I don't know if the methods that we have or some of the methods that like Sarah and Elisa talked about will be adequate for testing those type of episodes, but I love the idea of trying. Yeah.
Hello, thank you to all speakers. That was a great symposium. All right. I wanted to focus on Sarah, if I may. Sarah, I love this trial, as you know. And you may know we recently did a systematic review of all interoceptive treatments. We hope it's coming out any moment. And really, I could say this, your trial stands out in having one of the best qualities in a systematic review. So the field of training interoception is it's not very good yet. You know, there's all sorts of, from mindful to everything, and it's not very clear what are the mechanisms of action. I know it's a bit unfair to ask of you because you still already have done one of the best trials out there, and I know there's not enough time for a lot of measure. But if you just give us your intuition, what do you think could be, I mean, when you train your subjects, right? Is it a learning effect? Are you changing their attention? Is it the signal that gets, enhanced? What do you think is the mechanism of action?
It's such a good question. I mean, the connectivity findings speak to a neuromechanism, the fact that we did see enhanced connectivity of the insula, which is this key region, as you know. And one of my PhD students is collaborating closely with Carl Friston and Ryan Smith to do hierarchical Bayesian analyses on computational approaches. And he's looking at different mechanisms that drive it, modeling this data. And I'm a little shy to speak about it because it's like so far outside my comfort zone. But I know that what they're highlighting at the moment is what they're calling a lower level precision measure, which seems to be something about the nature of the afferent signal itself or early representation. And it seems to be that's the thing that changes. How it changes, why it changes, we don't know, but the modeling seems to be lower level precision as opposed to high level.
Hello, panel. Thank you very much. Sarah, I've got a question for you. I really liked your work and was very happy to hear how well she scored in your meta-analysis. For someone who spent his life in the clinic largely dealing with patient populations who battle for a large part of their adult life, chronic symptom profiles that were medically unexplained, I'm thinking that interoceptive accuracy training may have great relevance to a patient population that goes beyond the autistic people that you've been studying.
Yeah.
I found that insular training effect, the plasticity there that even in autistic individuals could be shifted in a positive direction. Very, very encouraging. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yes, I really, really love the question. And it's something I think about a lot. And I think something that's fascinating about interoception is that it does seem to have this tethering from consciousness in some way. Like our brains are being bombarded by signals all the time. But if we were distracted by them, then it would overwhelm us. And people can have very strong beliefs about what they think the body is doing, divorced from what the body is actually doing. And we can see that in the lab. And that divergence seems to get stronger in some patient populations. And there's absolutely scope for changing the precision into what people are sensing. And my hope is very much that that may have bearings for medically unexplained symptoms.
I just wanted to pop in one quick other question. When you've been in medicine a long time, you get the sense that often the big elephant in the waiting room is a history of childhood maltreatment. And given how difficult autistic children are to raise, I wondered if you were measuring that as a covariable or in your autistic population, if there were histories of maltreatment as a complicating factor.
Yeah, it was. I didn't look at that in this study. It's an interesting point. I got interested in interoception through working with people with trauma. Yes. And actually, that was the thing that made me think the role of the body and the body signals are fundamental for understanding conditions there. So it was actually what got me into that, or it wasn't something we studied specifically there.
Thank you.
Hi. Hello. I want to continue on that. I think it seems to be like a neural mechanism that is underlying the interoception thing. So I'm wondering, would you extend this to like normal healthy populations, and then you do a huge population studies with your metrics, and then do you think you're going to find that correlation in healthy populations? And like I'm wondering if the training like could be extended to other patients, stroke patients, and like anxiety disorder patients, and that would also work. And I'm also wondering if that training have a plateau. It's like if I ask a healthy person to do it, is there a like plateau somewhere, or yeah?
Yeah, so we've also run it in non-autistic individuals as well, just without the brain scans, and it worked in them as well. It also worked in people only with mild anxiety. So it seems to be a generalized mechanism that applies to individuals who aren't just autistic. I think though because especially in our autism data, it showed it really worked on 1/3 of the individuals, if you remember. So I think it's about those particular people who maybe have this imprecision initially, which may be the sort of etiology that contributes to their anxiety. So I think it may help on those people, irrespective of whether they're autistic or not. So it depends on the nature of the underlying, the same way that inflammation, targeting inflammation will work on 1/3 of people with depression. Some studies have shown this is a sort of another subset set of mechanisms that drive a particular group of anxiety individuals, irrespective of autistic. It's just a lot of autistic individuals seem to have this sensory change that made them a good population to look at in depth.
So would you expect, like, if you heavily increase the population that you test on, like healthy population, would you find like this mechanism in play? Would you expect
well,
that
it's certainly replicating in a non-autistic group. So
like if you have 1,000 people, healthy people, like come in.
Well, we haven't done 1,000, but it is replicating. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. This is a question for Jorge. So I'm completely convinced that we can't look at correlations between different tasks and infer that there's no general metacognitive ability, or there is. And then one of your solutions was to look at transfer. But I wondered whether the same concerns won't apply to transfer as well. So for example, there might not be transfer because you've just learned some new heuristic, some new bit of the value of some cue that doesn't apply across to some other domain. So I'm just becoming pretty pessimistic that we can ever figure out whether there is domain general metacognition. So maybe you could tell me a bit about the experiments that could help us resolve that.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a great question. I don't think you're wrong. I mean, I think that lack of transfer, or even the presence of transfer of training, could be misleading and might not be because of a shared mechanism. It could be but because of a common mechanism between two different metacognitive mechanisms, right? Like maybe you're training not metacognition in, let's say, perception, or like or a general mechanism of metacognition, but maybe you're training fluency with or just comfort doing the task, or who knows, right? You can do many other things that show these, and obviously it could fail for a million reasons. So in that sense, like, I agree, it's not a fail-safe in any way. I think that it could be a little bit more grounded in mechanisms, or at least things that we can further test, because a correlation is like you get it or you don't, and kind of that's the end of the story, the way I see it. Whereas with transfer or with training, like you can further push the system, right? Like you can make predictions, you can make interventions, you can try to lesion the system and so on in ways that might allow us to make further claims. That, or at least that's the hope. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I guess this is we're at time, unfortunately. This has been lovely. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak, and thank you for being here.